for lack of a better word, democratic tongue. It has a lot of words for a lot of different things. The Iroquois speech patterns are extremely specific, extremely acquisitive, and extremely aggressive. So interesting. But that's it. So those are just my responses. The only other comment I want to say is you're sitting in a school in response to Dr. Coley's presentation that about 25 years ago was ready to fold because it was no longer operating as it was designed as an independent, parent-run, child-centered school for children that had no grades, no testing, and was about to go out of business, and maybe should have. Instead, they hired a very aggressive, very highly visible Upper East Side private school teacher and leader who turned it into a thriving institution that's no longer progressive, but successful and expensive, and no longer. Well, actually, as one of the teachers, my daughter went here, that's why I know a lot about it. One of the old-time teachers here said, yes, it's still a community school, but the community has changed. Definitely. Okay. For any of us who've grown up in the village, we know that the community has changed. Anyway, so what I was going to then finish the afternoon in terms of my presentation about, and I'll mostly open it to questions once I make a few comments, and then we'll take it from there, was what I call roughly our roots in nature and the clinical significance and application of self-regulation. Okay? In terms of what the goals of orgone treatment are and why discussions of self-regulation or the study of self-regulation in living organisms to me is useful not just as a curiosity or as a theoretical engagement, but because it really is at the heart of, I think, what Reich really imagined treatment, if it was possible at all, to be successful, as really encompassing. That the final goal is of orgone treatment, and in a sense, and Reich was fairly generous on this. He viewed that the goal of any therapy, he was very clear in saying to a number of his students, and this was then passed on to me by them, Dr. Sobey, Dr. Herskovitz, who's still alive, is the last of the breed, and Dr. Rothenberg, people I work with. Reich was very, very clear that the goal was to essentially restore natural pulsation in the organism to the extent that the organism was capable of that. We all understand that both as patients as well as anyone who does this work, and Reich was very clear that this could be done not only in orgonomy, that there were other therapies and other therapists who were capable. But what he was interested in, what he would often say, is that the key was not the specific clinical modality, right? Even though he felt that clearly, and I would concur, that orgonomy offers a great deal of useful and very, very productive ways of working on the living organism. Reich was very clear that the key was in the practitioner. So he was often very, very actively able to say that, he would say to Dr. Sobey, used to love to joke and say, Reich would say, Dr. Sobey, there are good psychoanalysts who can do as much as any orgonomist or more, and such and such. And he said the key is really the individual who's doing the treatment, not specifically the model. So in reverse, that you can have individuals. Professor Coley and I were talking at lunch about how you get these individuals who are committed in theory to all these great ideas, who are child abusers, who hate working in classrooms, can't stand being around those little brats, even though they're the ones who are writing theories about how it works. So none of that really surprised Reich. So the issue was not that you're an orgonomist, therefore you're somehow vaccinated, or that you're you believe in or you're committed to child-centered child-centered education, and therefore, or that you're a parent who's committed to self-regulation and you're healthy enough to do that. The joke was talking about someone who was committed to self-regulation and insisted that whether the kid liked it or not, they were going to be self-regulated, and never quite got. Yeah, but that was very, very common, I think, in response to this. So, with that in mind, I think the key issues here are that the goal of any treatment, and unquestionably, specifically the goal of orgone therapy, is to establish and restore natural pulsation. What that means is in the process, it requires resolving the things that prevent that. We would talk about that. You can do this in many ways, and it's presented in different ways in different treatments. We would present that as being able to establish orgastic potency, the ability for the organism to pulsate in charge and discharge as freely as possible without any interference from external influences one way or the other. But in order to do that, one would have to, and one must, and one does, when we do the work successfully, both as practitioners and as patients, when the work is successful, what we experience is the resolution or the resolving of blocks, places where, for a variety of reasons in the body and behavior, the organism is prevented from making effective, pulsatory responses, okay, of a self-regulating nature. The implications of this for what happens when this is possible is that you can often wind up even with an open organism, and certainly we see this in child rearing. You get an open organism, but if it encounters a world that is compulsive, it becomes increasing, which is basically the kinds of societies we live in both through our families and in our schools and even in our free schools. When we encounter that, the organism becomes a non-self-regulating organism. It begins to adjust and adapt as best it can to the conditions that we live in. And that's something I think is often very, very neglected, certainly in this work, is that no matter how much we accomplish in our own treatment or in the treatment of any patient or in our work with children and the education of children and helping them to become freer, is that we all of us, sans none, go out and live, and we live our lives here today as well as when we leave here in the compulsive world. To the degree that we struggle against it, that we fight against it, that we try to change it or act differently is very, very commendable and important in terms of the struggle. But the reality is none of us escape the compulsive, imposition of a social system that we live in. And I think we could go into numerous anecdotal accounts of how, what, when, and where. Then the next question I think is often worth always considering is, what would a self-regulated individual look like? Could they survive in an armored society? This was a big question at the end for Reich, or what Dr. Sobey often would say is, if I got you, and I'm sure anyone who's or they've heard me say, if I got you to be fully open and really alive, you would make it down to the corner. You'd be out before you got there. So that the problem is always whether we can really, and what we're doing when we view what we're dealing with here in terms of the armored society we live in. Now, you could become pessimistic and believe that, therefore, what's the use, what's the hope? I think Reich remained incredibly optimistic, and so do I, and I'm sure, I know a number of the people here, certainly the presenters that were here today, but I know a number of you, on various levels, feel similarly that it's not hopeless, it's just a constant struggle. And that struggle is what it's about. And the other thing is that you cannot impose self-regulation. So you can't. One of the problems, and I think in many of the self-regulating approaches in child therapy or in schools or community